Okay, everyone, welcome. It's July 27th, 2021. We are in a pre-council workshop this evening. It's 5:31 p.m. And this workshop is on employee housing opportunities. Nora and Caitlin, welcome and thank you. I'm going to just turn it right over to you.
Thank you. Caitlin's going to be taking notes, so it's not like she's working on other stuff while we're doing the presentation.
Thank you.
Just to give you a heads up. And I consulted with her as I wrote the staff report, and several of the suggested options come from Caitlin. So it incorporates both of our brainstorming. And anyway, okay. So I think we're all aware, extremely aware, that this year has been really hard for various different kinds of employees to find housing. And not just low-end employees, even employees that make more money. And businesses are really impacted by it, and that can be reflected in the reduced hours of operation. There are many places that, like I go to Hidden Cuisine, and they're not serving dinner anymore, and I'm bummed, but it's because they can't get the servers. And many of the businesses have restricted their hours because they can't get people to work. I think it's impacted quality of service. I think meals obviously are taking longer to get out, and there just it's not the same level of service as it has been in the past. And that affects the residents and the visitors of Moab. City, police, hospital, and others can't attract candidates for even full-time, even salary positions. And jobs actually have been offered. There have been a couple of police jobs offered, and then we had a planner one. We offered her a job, and she couldn't figure out how to live here, so she ended up turning it down. And the police have had the same experience. And I think other employers like us, government, and special service districts are all having the same trouble. There's definitely a lack of employee housing supply. And the land costs are so high that it doesn't make financial sense right now to propose employee housing necessarily, because the property values are so high. The folks that are looking at those properties don't think they can make it pencil at the rate that the properties are going for. So its highest and best use would be the R3. 20 units per acre plus or minus, and that's what everybody assumes when they walk in the door, minimum. And making that pencil for employee units is tough. So a little bit, when I first started in 2019, I was awed and amazed that the City Council had taken such really progressive, risky, done some things that were bold and risky. And it was all, before we started the whole process, we had the BAE Economic Study Parts 1 and Part 2. That was kind of the basis for moving forward with some of these other standards. And I reread these reports, and they are really outdated. The numbers that they quote are not even nowhere near today. So from 2017 to today, a lot has changed in terms of property values and rents. We did the Planned Affordable Housing Ordinance, which is a great idea and I think can be fixed so that we can make it a little bit more usable and attractive. And we want to also consider looking at it in different zones perhaps, but we started that process. And I think both Caitlin and I have weighed in on some things that we think could help the pad. Employee housing, there was this employee housing requirement for new overnight accommodations, the WAHU, which was awesome until we decided not to allow any new overnight accommodations. And then that kind of hit a wall. So we do have some money, mostly that's going to Walnut Lane, but because there are two projects, well, one project's left, really, one hotel that hasn't paid their WAHU, and they're still moving through the application process. And then we purchased Walnut Lane, And that was really big and gutsy. And as we all know, it's not an easy project. And Caitlin has done amazing things, but we're running into all the same issues that everybody else is with construction costs, and nationwide people are having trouble getting financing for various things, and including small businesses to build stuff. And so anyway, that's been a struggle, but we'll move forward. And then a simplified ADU process, and somewhere around this time frame, you made the process easier. And the Planning Commission right now is sort of building upon what was done before and seeing how we can make it even easier and generate more of them. And we've had 2 work sessions on it with the Planning Commission. So here's some issues and trends. Land and housing costs, obviously. Land availability, there's just not that much left that's relatively easy to build on in Moab. So instead, what we're seeing is a pressure for higher density housing in the R3 without any requirement for employee housing or otherwise deed restricted units. So that is the highest and best use, and that's what's driving our land costs. So that's just reality, and it makes the most sense for developers to build luxury townhomes in the R3 right now, and that's where they're going to make the most money, so that's what they're proposing. We have existing trailer parks. We have a couple of them that are being looked at to scrape them and build townhomes, mostly second homes, not cheap. And that's a trend that's really disturbing. Because I know it's not great housing, but it's housing. And if to lose all those, we'll just be in more in a backlog of trying to find very affordable housing, and that's going to be tough. But we have talked to a number of people who are proposing to do that. Or we also have a lot of underdeveloped lots, I like to say, in Moab, that may be a fairly large property or several properties combined, but there may be one house. And so again, what people are looking to in terms of value is that maximum density. Businesses have been deeply impacted by the lack of employee housing. And then the city has limited financial resources to provide incentives such as the Veil and Deep program. Not saying that that's totally off the table, but what was it? We heard they're buying the deed restrictions for like $200,000 or something. So obviously, we don't have the money to get into that kind of money, but maybe there are some people out of the goodness of their heart that want to do this or something. So our target audiences. And there's a lot of overlap, but it also seems like we're trying to get at a certain target audiences. Temporary housing are those who are just moving to town. For example, the planner one that we wanted to hire, she certainly could have lived in a bedroom of a house somewhere, but we don't have that. We don't even have that situation. So housing for those moving to town who probably will get into more permanent housing, but if it's going to take a while and take them a while to be here and actually be available to know where they want to live and when something comes up. Also, homelessness is an issue, and it's really temporary housing, and in some cases not so temporary, but it's an issue. Temporary seasonal employees, some of the lowest wages type jobs that are seasonal. And then seasonal employees, mostly I just termed it outdoor adventure employees. So folks that work for like the rivers and that are seasonal. And they obviously can't find places to live either. These are the folks that are looking for places to park an RV or anything for the season. And this fall, we will certainly, right now we're busy, but this fall we'll probably be really busy again. So that will be an issue. Year-round employees that make over the minimum that you can make for the deed restrictions. Otherwise, they make too much money to qualify for a deed restriction, deed restricted unit, but they don't make enough to actually afford housing, given today's market. Lower income year-round employees, these are, shop owners, clerks, restaurant workers, kind of what makes our community run. And they're year-round employees. And some of those folks may qualify under the deed restriction requirements. And then year-round employees who are considered like missing middle, like I talked about before, or permanent full-time employees, salaried even, and they would be able to find a home in a normal market, but we haven't had a normal market for quite a while, especially not now. And that includes, emergency service workers in the city and the hospital, and these places are really important to have employees, but it's been tough. So what I did is I created this project policy spreadsheet, and Caitlin and I just sort of talked through a bunch of stuff, and we thought we'd just kind of throw everything we could think of right now onto the wall and see what sticks. So some of these ideas may be so far from what you're interested in, that you don't even want to discuss them, and that's fine. We just thought we'd kind of put stuff out there, and it's certainly not an exhaustive list, so it's just what we had been hearing and ideas that have come up with. We've gotten a lot of recent inquiries and emails about various kinds of manufactured homes, and everybody's been sending those around, and they're great, and Caitlin has followed up on a number of those, so we've met with some folks, whether that's a solution to Walnut Lane or something else. We're starting to have those discussions. So we talk about the project description, the audience is targeted, the pros and cons / impediments, which can, and then potential funding needs, which is actually addressed in the pros and cons. Time frame for implementation, and a lot of these are not quick fixes at all. They will take time and energy and controversy. So I think it's going to be really interesting and challenging and fun, but that's my worked brain after doing this for a long time. But this is the kind of stuff that is really great for engaging the community, and it's what we really want to do as planners, is stuff like this, so we can really try to help move the city forward. So once we have some direction as to what initiatives you might want to move forward with, we'll need to come up with some strategy approaches to use for those changes. And some things may include involving the business community, meeting with them, seeing if they have, I know several of them have contacted us and said they either want to build housing or they wouldn't mind putting some money toward housing somewhere, but they don't have the land necessarily to do it all. So, maybe there's a project out there that's a public-private project, I don't know, but it's certainly possible. So we want to involve the business community. The temporary RV parking and camping that is talked about in the matrix could go through a temporary zoning ordinance, which is 180 days, but we would primarily limit it April through November, our kind of high season. And then Lori was looking into a little bit about emergency proclamations. Both URA and Telluride have done they've changed their codes with emergency provisions to allow these camping RVs, and I think they're hoping to get some funding from the state around that too. So Lori's going to be looking more into that if we choose to go that way. Collaborate with the business community to build more units or contribute to Walnut Lane or other affordable housing projects, and then a working group, which would include realtors, developers, business owners, planning commissioners, city council members, and citizens at large. And that kind of group would be good for some of the larger initiatives.
Hey, Nora, if I may, the RV temporary ordinance, is that a one-shot deal, or could it be made permanent seasonally every year?
Well, it depends on how we want to frame it. We could make it seasonal for the year, probably, for those busy months. But I think that the hope is that we will, at some point, dig ourselves a little bit out of this problem, and that maybe that is something that we don't necessarily need anymore.
Okay, I'll just state, I'm just worried about conflicts in state statute. Temporary ordinance, I mean, I read 6 months, you got to be finished doing whatever it is you want to do in 6 months. So if it reoccurred again next year, it would violate that. That was my question.
Yeah, if we did it as a temporary zoning ordinance, it would have to be done every year.
Oh, we'd have to reenact it every year then, basically.
If we don't do it as an emergency or as a temporary zoning ordinance, we could probably write something in the code that allows it seasonally. And then if we decide that that's not necessary anymore, we could change the code.
Oh,
Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. Okay, so with all of that, and here's the spreadsheet. And I sent it all to you in landscape in a separate version so that you could read it all on one page of the Excel file. This one it doesn't quite work because I made all the font a little bigger so people could actually maybe read it. But, all right, so start at the beginning. What I tried to do is kind of divide these into projects, zoning initiatives, projects, and policies. So ADU changes, I mentioned before, the Planning Commission is working on those. We're looking at whether it makes sense to do some reduced setbacks and building heights. Most of the time when people come in and they're unable to do ADUs, it's because of the setback issue, and that 12-foot rear setback is a real impediment. And maybe maybe we do 7 feet all around, maybe we do 5 feet, but the Planning Commission is considering that, and we'll make a recommendation for you on that. And then building height, we have this funny thing that says that if you have a garage, you can put an ADU on top of it, but the maximum height is 20 feet, which is pretty tough and almost impossible for somebody to do. In fact, we had one that was claiming to do it, and they came out like 21.6, just the way it all worked. So that's another thing the Planning Commission is considering. And then other, they're talking about multiple ADUs per house, and whether an ADU wants there needs to be an ownership requirement. We also have to make changes based upon the new state law. And the new state law is really permissive for interior ADUs, which are those that, like a basement of a house, if it's turned into an ADU. There are no size requirements that we're allowed to do. Our building inspection folks are limited in their powers to regulate for public health and ventilation and stuff like that. We have been instructed not to look at some of those things. We're not allowed, any kinds of conditions, but there is a requirement for owner occupancy. So just for the ones that are in interior ADUs is what they call it. Okay, we've been getting a lot of information, as I mentioned, on tiny homes, camp park homes, those kinds of things, modular, manufactured in various forms. And right now, if somebody were to come in to us and want to do sort of a tiny home village, we don't really have the mechanism to do that. I mean, we could do it in the R3, maybe as a PUD, or anyway, we don't have an easy way to do it. It would be manipulating our existing code, but we may want to consider actually making amendments specifically for that. Many communities have done that. Evaluate vacant properties and consider changing the zoning to allow employee housing on some of them. Chuck and Dedar just did a vacant property inventory, and maybe there are certain areas that we want to encourage employee housing in those zones, but they may not be zoned correctly right now. So we can talk about that. Consider allowing 4 stories for employee housing. This is kind of a big one that the county has a project, it's just outside the city limits, and they want to do 4 stories. We've never done a 4-story building in Moab, neither has the county. So it would be a major change to allow a 4-story building. Maybe it's something you want to consider for employee housing, maybe it's not, but certainly all the folks that have come in to talk to us about employee housing have started out with 4 floors, and we said, no, you can only do 3. And that obviously definitely impacts their pro forma. So it's kind of,
if I may, so are we talking about from 30 feet max to
30
40 or 42?
it's 40, right now it's 40 feet max, well, it depends on the zone. It's either 35 or 40, 30 or 40. In the commercial districts, it's 40, but you can only do 3 floors. That's the way the code reads. It's a maximum of 3 floors.
So what is,
Can you bring your microphone closer?
when you have developers come in talking about 4 floors, what is the height that they would actually need to accomplish that?
45 to 50 feet, probably. If they want to, if they want a first floor that's, I don't know. It depends on how they want to structure it, but I would say.
They could do 4 stories if they did a basement, but what happens is you run up against parking requirements when
Right.
you have that much of a density.
Right,
You can achieve
Definitely.
4, but the first has to be like sub.
yeah. It has to be more than 50% below, which is below grade, which is not as desirable, but it could be, we could take a look at that.
Even with like a flat roof, you can still really only go 3 based on the height requirement.
Yeah, and we require a sloped roof in our code too, so we don't allow flat roofs. Allow bunkhouses and dormitories in some zones. Right now, we do have a dormitory, and that's at the CR property that they put their seasonal folks and their Vista folks in. We've had another request that we're actually going to take to the Planning Commission at some point. They filed an application for, well, what I like to call a man camp. Carly loves that term, but with lots of bedrooms and bathrooms in one big long building, but then a central kitchen recreation area. And I've been up to Alaska where they do the pipeline, and these things are real, these man camps. They're really
But
amazing.
one of the tour companies has one very similar out
Yes,
um,
indeed,
in the valley.
right. So it's something that.
And
has
it's
been done
nice.
before.
I toured it. Yeah, it's nice.
It serves a certain purpose.
It does.
And the person who's applying for it runs a large business, and so he's looking at it for all of his employees and then running a shuttle to and from. And what he's also proposing is some townhome units that are a little bit nicer for families for some of the positions. So anyway, we're figuring out a way to make that work with our existing code, but we wanted to make it more explicitly permitted if that's what you want to do.
And it was permitted by community rebuilds in the C2. So it was specifically that zone, I think, where a bunkhouse checked the boxes, as it was like a blend of commercial and residential, allowed for multifamily, but was still kind of falling under that single family zone. So it is
Sort of.
clunky, yeah.
Yeah, and we actually.
Oh, it's considered a single-family residence,
Right,
because it's one
exactly.
kitchen.
Right. That's the interpretation, the way we're doing it now, but it would be good to have more specific regs to allow that.
Well, because the question is, number of family members. We took family out of the code. And so right
Right,
now, somebody
household.
could technically build a bunkhouse in R2,
Right.
based on code. You could build,
R3 is more comfortable, but yeah,
yeah. Well, because we're not counting number of unmarried individuals in a house.
right. It could be done in R2. Amending the parking.
Well, so, I guess since we're on that though, so we do allow bunkhouses,
Yeah,
not dormitories, in any zone that allows for a single family allows for a bunkhouse.
Yeah, that's a single family, basically. Amend the pad so that it's more functional, and part of that is the next item, which is parking requirements. And we have had some people approach us to do the pad, and the numbers don't work primarily because of the parking requirements. We had that trouble at Walnut Lane. It's real tough to make a project fit all of the development standards. And the big limiting factor seems to be parking. And then maybe even considering pad in the R2 again. And I know that was taken out when this was approved, but it might be something that you want to talk about. And then parking requirements for employee housing. R3 density, this is something that I've been talking about pretty much since I got here. That our current R3 zone, and Caitlin and I have talked about this another, and Caitlin and I have talked about this a number of times. But our R3 zoning, which is a big chunk of town, allows 20.7 units per acre roughly. And there's no requirement for any deed restriction or employee local housing or anything like that. So that's what people want to do, highest and best use. And so that's what we see. And so we may want to look at the R3 zone and look at a lower base density and then allowing more density if they are employee or somehow deed restricted, whether that's for local employee or based upon wages and financial implications. So that's something that both Caitlin and I have kind of run some numbers around, and so I'm anxious to get into that discussion with you, but it will certainly be controversial. There's no doubt about it. RVs as temporary emergency housing, and this is the first sort of policy. And again, as I mentioned, these have been done in Crested Butte and in Uray, and it allows RVs or tents. So Uray is, I think they both say camping. So anyway, the idea is if somebody has an RV, they can park it in your driveway, or somebody can pitch a tent in your backyard as long as they have a relationship with the residents for water. And there are different ways that they are handling wastewater, but one of them required wastewater dumping every 3 days. So there's a way to do it. And it may also be something that we want to consider in the commercial zones. There are some commercial properties that are out there waiting for the overnight accommodations to come back, because that's allowed some C4 properties and some recreation commercial properties, or resort commercial properties, that people are just sitting on because we can't do overnight, we aren't allowing any new overnight accommodations, and they're going to probably wait it out until that happens. But in the meantime, maybe they're interested in some kind of a temporary situation where they could build spaces for RVs for their employees, or theirs and others' employees. And maybe even it could be something that could eventually morph into another RV overnight accommodation camping thing in the long run, perhaps. Just throwing some thoughts out there. But this RV thing is, I don't know how it's working, but it'll be interesting to see. Short-term employee RV park in the C4, that's what I just talked about.
Caitlin, question. I know when I was back on county commission, Colin Fryer out south of town bought a bunch of trailers, parked them out there, and for his employees, how's that worked out? Do you guys know?
I haven't heard much about it.
It was a forward-thinking look.
Yeah, he is, and he's actually who we're dealing with on this other project. So he has built employee housing and he wants to do more. And run a shuttle, which is awesome.
Without taking too much time, may I ask one more
That's
Sure.
question? Cane Creek touched on this. R3, here's my question for you. R3, market rate, no deed restrictions. It was built out to the full allowed density of 21 units, more or less, per acre kind of thing. What are the chances that developers promise all kinds of things and you never know what they're going to do? Okay, that's one of my problems with it, and that's one of the reasons I like PUDs, but I'm digressing now. But suppose that a developer decided to build multifamily housing, and as opposed to townhomes, for example, or maybe he won't. I don't know. My question is, of your 5 income groups that you had up here a moment ago, would any of them be able to afford this in a brand new development that started conception today?
Without them offering to do deed restrictions, you mean just market
Without
rate?
deed restrictions?
Yeah,
The
so,
Cane Creek are more affordable.
and we will see. We have this concept out there that everybody's throwing around that's affordable by design. So they're small studio or one-bedroom apartments that by their very nature, because they're small, they will cost less. I have no idea. Cane Creek is sort of the first example. I don't know what they're marketing those at. They just started construction, and we shall see if it works or not.
Well, to give you an extreme example, I don't know if this is represented, so so take that for what it's worth. But a friend of mine, his daughter just moved into a studio apartment, the second floor over on the west side of town, over Westwater Drive. And I think it includes utilities and stuff like that. $2,000 a month.
Yeah.
So my question for you is $2,000 a month something that anybody can afford on your list here?
Not many. Maybe,
Yeah, that's what I thought.
maybe police officers might be able to.
Just to share, the Cane Creek condominiums that are next to the Department of Workforce Services, they're listed at like for a studio 204. The one bed is 219. I'm just looking at their website. They've all sold out like that.
Yeah, they're for sale units.
Yeah, but none of them are available anymore.
And they were, for the first couple of weeks, it was only to locals and no one bought any. So it went,
So it's probably.
Locals need a little more time to like pre-qualify as well, so, I mean, yeah. But those are priced at, and this is the first time studio units for sale have ever been in the Moab market. So, I mean, it's proving a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Emily, I'm sorry, the prices were I thought I heard you say 200 and something, I don't think that's right.
Yeah, the most expensive unit of the development, the 2 bedrooms are $244,000.
Oh, that's the sales price in thousands of dollars.
Correct.
It wasn't the monthly rent.
Oh, no. And rent is gonna be dependent upon your terms of your mortgage. So, give or take.
Right.
But 200, you're gonna, be 12 to 1,400.
200 something for a 2-bedroom?
Yeah, $204,000 for a 500 square foot studio, because our minimum square footage is 500.
I wouldn't necessarily call that real affordable, but it's better than nothing. But I suspect who's buying them are people who come down here all the time and want to have a little place while they're here. I suspect, I don't know for sure, but if we know they offered them to locals and we didn't get any takers, so that's the assumption. Enforce illegal nightly rentals in residential zones. So we all know that Airbnb and VRBO pretty much caught the world or planning offices all over by surprise. Shouldn't have probably, but it did. And so we do have many existing non-conforming uses. There are nightly rentals that are legal in our residential zones. We also have a bunch that I'm sure are not legal that are listed probably on Airbnb and VRBO and all those. And it would take a lot of time and energy to try to figure out what those are and try to enforce upon them. And especially since the state law right now says that we can't use the websites, Vacasa, Airbnb, VRBO, we can't use their websites to determine for purposes of a violation. So we can't use those when we're hunting. So that might be something that we need to look at statewide. And I think that there will probably be a bill introduced to discuss that in the next legislative session.
Hey,
So-
Nora, it's past 6 o'clock now, so maybe we
Okay.
can speed through it and
Yeah.
get to it.
Okay, consider a housing mitigation replacement program. Salt Lake City requires that if you're tearing down an employee housing, you have to either pay a fee or build replacement units. And I don't think their fee is not very high, but they have been doing that for quite a number of years. So that will take some additional research, but it's not unheard of. Possible acquisition of property, doing a public-private employee housing project, sort of like Walnut Lane, only with partners. Purchase of homes and rent out to bedrooms to employees. This is that temporary situation. You know, if the city had a house that had 4 bedrooms, and so when we hire people, they can stay there for the first 6 months until they figure out where they can live permanently. Of course, we don't have much money, but that's an option. Provide transportation to and from employee housing areas, commercial and downtown. Hopefully, our shuttle will help with that, and we want to make sure that it does. And then avail and deed type of program. Again, we have funding issues with that. Simplify deed restrictions is something that Caitlin has been working on. Develop a program for local businesses to pay into a housing fund, and that could go toward Walnut Lane or other projects. Use some ARPA funds for Walnut Lane. And also use some ARPA funds perhaps for projects that need a little push. Anyway, and then forgive illegal, this is something that actually a member of the public raised. So we have we also know we have a bunch of illegal duplexes out there, and one person suggested allowing those to continue and legalize them and make sure that they meet building code. It's out there as a consideration. So,
What do you mean when you say illegal duplex?
so they were single families, they're in the R2, and they've been changed into two-family. Well, two-family duplex in the R2 is fine. But there are, like, there's one that had 3 single families as part of a sort of a court arrangement, and 2 of them had turned into duplexes, and the density based upon the land area would not allow that. So we made them take it out, you know, which it was really hard to make that decision, you know? But that's what our code required at this point in time.
Okay.
So, let me go back to the PowerPoint real quick. So, the questions for council to consider, what other projects might you add? And you don't have to tell me tonight. You can email me any and all of your ideas, and we can stick it in there. What are the priorities? And the mayor suggested that we go around the room and then you talk about what your kind of favorite ideas are and what your least favorite ideas are. And then we'll start to form some priorities. And what we'll do is we'll come back to you after this work session and kind of do a modified version that is based upon your priorities.
Or like an affordable housing work plan
Yeah,
for staff.
yeah, exactly. Affordable housing work plan, excellent. Employee housing. Try to call this
Housing
employee
affordability work plan, that it's not just for 80% or below.
Right. Is there low-hanging fruit that we should move forward with right away? Like, do you like the RV thing? Is that something we should pursue right away? We're already working on the ADUs. And what are things that we're trying to solve within the next 60 days and then 1 year and 2 years? Just keep that in your mind. Because some of these are very different. It's apples and oranges as to how they would work. So we need to take that into consideration. So with that, it's all yours.
Well, I'm happy to go first. I do want to hear from every council member regarding what floats to the top in your mind and what's at the bottom, just to kind of shape out where we're headed as a body. And then, yeah, I do look forward to a housing affordability work plan. So I can just go first, and I think we can be pretty succinct. For me, I really would like to see, so it's kind of a hybrid of a couple of these suggestions, but I have, in seeing what they're doing in Colorado and having tried to do this myself back in the former developer years, when we talked about doing a tiny home development or a like seasonal employee housing modular type thing, when I went to the city and the county, just as a developer, what I found was you would have to put it in an RV type zone, and those RV type zones are commercial and allow for overnight accommodations. So for me, one way that we could say yes to the more like, long-term RV parks is to have an actual long-term RV slash camp park zone. So we could say, all right, we would allow that in the R3, the C1, the C2, the C4, C5. And it would be a specific type of thing that, a specific type of allowable use. And it would be specifically for long-term and not for short-term. And so it would be monthly, rental by the month as opposed to by the night. What's nice about that is that it can allow for a breadth of different typologies, whether it's a tiny home or a like flat out RV, or if somebody wanted to get creative and do like, we saw one person in town do the, what are the silver, Airstreams, yeah. So there would be flexibility in the typology, but the sort of structure would be the same, that it would be a type of camp park. So it would be units without permanent foundation that would each require a hookup, and then would be, the units themselves would not be inspected by the building inspector, because an RV doesn't conform to HUD standards. And so the building inspector would essentially only be inspecting based on water, sewer, right?
Do you want me to switch the view so you can see, so Robin can be in this conversation?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that would be great. Yeah. So that would be my top. And then my low, my bottom is the 4 stories. And the reason for that is like over the past 10 years that we've been having this conversation, that feels the most offensive to our community. And so I would rather look for density and smaller and creative with parking before we went 4 stories, because we have a view shed thing that we love so much. But that's for me. That's my top and my bottom. And I do want to point out again that bunkhouses are allowed in all zones,
Yeah.
that a single family is allowed.
Right.
So that you did bunkhouses slash dorms. And I do think that we need to consider putting in code specifics regarding dorms, especially since we've got property, USU and surrounding, that's in the city limits where we don't have any real guidelines to dormitories. But what I would hope is that our dormitory guidelines would be broad. And maybe we allow dorms as 4 stories over there.
That toward USU is probably where that would happen.
Yeah, that's me. Who wants to go next?
I'll go.
So great.
So as I was thinking about what are my top priorities, I was trying to figure out how do I frame it, because there's a lot of good ideas here. Thanks for capturing all these different ideas and thoughts and getting them out in a succinct manner. And it seems like we both have a short-term emergency, and for that, it seems like we could I'd be open to looking at following the lead of some other communities and doing, allowing RV camping on a temporary basis. And as it's temporary, we can just see how it goes and try to take some of the pressure off in the short term while some of the pending inventory in the county gets built out. And then I was also, like, one way that I've seen communities approach their visioning and strategic planning is what if you don't do what you regret or result in unmitigatable harm to communities down the road? And so, as Nora mentioned, I've been thinking about our existing incentives for zoning, and it seems like on one end we have PAD, but then which is great in terms of providing a lot of housing, affordable housing if it gets used, but then the rest of our zoning, especially the R3 and R4, doesn't really incentivize employee housing, and it seems like it has some potential to. So, and in looking at how our densities work, I feel like PUDs have potential too, to offer a continuum of development opportunities that include just like market rate, but primary residence through different levels of income restrictions. So I feel like there's a lot of potential there to provide incentives or requirements in our existing zones as they get redeveloped to be a mix of both second homes and residents. And because much of R3 is developed as single family, there is potential that like we could have both more second homes and more employee housing if we do it right.
Yeah, and I was going to add that to the list. Our PUD section of the code is not really well used, I don't think, and I think that's part of the problem is the way it's drafted, and I think we could change it up to make it more useful.
Mm-hmm. And then in terms of, I've got a number in the like bottom, but I feel like some of them are things that are already in progress, and I support the work on that, like ADU changes, great. I don't know that carry on, but I don't know how that works in the, but as far as things, I wasn't prepared to address that.
What you don't like?
What I don't like. And it's more like, it seems like it'll be just politically fraught or expensive more than anything, so.
Well, and this is also a moment of off the cuff, and so
Yeah.
like
Right.
certainly like let's just kind of have a first response, but don't worry, you're not going to be held to like, you know, if you're not if nothing's sticking out as like a sore thumb, don't worry. And if there's something that tomorrow morning you're like, oh man, that's totally my top, and I didn't
Right.
say it, that's fine too.
Okay, so I guess one that concerns me is develop a program for local businesses to pay into a housing fund. I can see a partnership with a specific project, but as far as having an ongoing thing, I'm skeptical about what it would yield and then creating expectations for businesses that if we accept this money and then delivering something tangible in a timely manner.
Right.
Thanks, Kaylin. Who's next?
I can go next. My top, and it's not on this list, but
Okay.
I don't want to let Walnut Lane fall
Oh,
by the
yeah.
wayside.
That's kind of the given, but
Maybe it is a given, but I just wanted to say that.
I'll add it.
I tend to agree with Emily that we probably need to look at our code and make some changes for tiny homes or different, not untraditional housing types. What that looks like, I'm not 100% sure, but, and I kind of struggle with this because at no point in my life was living in a tiny home feasible. And so I kind of struggle with who would want to live in 300 square feet, you know? But
How big is the car?
I guess there are people that's perfectly acceptable to. And so my own bias can't cloud that might be a solution. I'm not excited about the 4 stories either. I think we'll have very, very enraged citizens. And I am all for reworking the pad to make it more feasible and more usable and more friendly. Again, I've never been in a position where I didn't need a car, but I know that there are people out there that don't. So, and I do agree with Kaylin. You guys have put together a lot of really good ideas. I don't know how you prioritize them all, but and what worries me about allowing camping or the RVs in on private properties is that they will become problematic. As I read through, I think it was Ure's amendment, it looked like they had captured a lot of the things that could potentially turn into issues, and they had good ways of mitigating them quickly if they did. So if we were going to do something like that, I would like to follow their model.
Yeah.
I know that there are people that will try and put 6 tents in their backyard if we don't put some brakes on that and make some boundaries quickly. So I think that's about it.
Thanks, Tony. Who's next? And Ronnie, we've got you here, so if you're ready, you can shine.
Okay, let me just pull up my screen. I was just trying not to repeat what other people said, but sorry, some of the font is small, so I'm going to stare into the screen here. One of the first things I'm interested in as I was looking through things are any tools available to us, and I'm fine if we're the community in the state to be on the cutting edge of this, but to figure out how to prioritize housing for primary workforce. So whether that's making zoning changes, like you guys are talking about for R3, where if you're going to have higher density, but I'm also interested if there are actually things you can do, because at some point, if you acknowledge that you have a crisis, which a lot of communities in Utah are acknowledging, part of the crisis is realizing you don't have community anymore if you don't house the people who make this a community and who serve the people who come here. And so I'm very interested in pushing the envelope on what tools are available to us legally to prioritize the ability for primary residents to get housing. And so I don't know what restrictions are allowed in code and what needs to be pushed legislatively if those tools aren't there, but maybe we can help if they aren't there to push the state to understand that, because somebody needs to wake up. With the camping and RVs, my concern about that is kind of a justice issue. I don't think any of us want to create a second or third class of workers or put a tool in place that just gets used as a stopgap for never solving our problems. So I'm totally open to discussing it and trying it. I'd be more comfortable with it happening on commercial properties or outfitter properties than residential. And like Tawny, if it's going to be residential, I'm much more interested in the more careful look or the more detailed look, at least in the example that we seem to have from Ouray than we had from Crested Butte. I do believe that it looked like Crested Butte was looking at camping and RVs, and I think I only saw RVs in the Ouray one, and I kind of feel like that's a separate discussion because there were so many issues involved. It looked like Crested Butte, there was no charge. It looked like there was a charge in Ouray. It wasn't clear to me if people are potentially paying property owners. So I think it's very interesting. It's probably worth a pilot and trying, but I also feel like you have to be very careful that it doesn't become a slippery slope to just like, oh, our problems are solved.
No.
We have cheap housing for people, and never pushing for something better. So I'm interested in more discussion about that. I'm interested in a pilot that looks at what happens when you provide a little less parking, and I'm not opposed to trying that at Walnut Lane. Because it seems like as a city project, it might be the one to experiment with that. I mean, there's always the ongoing debate. If you provide less parking, are you going to have a parking nightmare? And it's a fair question, but then you also get a lot of stories from younger people that they don't want a car. So it seems like at some point, we probably just need to test it. There are other things out there that might have to go to the legislature, but in some states, you actually have a real estate transfer tax every time a property flips. There is some money that goes to the city and the county, and kind of a wilder devil's advocate idea, but I don't know if anyone is using that in the US.
Oh, yeah, Colorado uses it. Colorado uses it extensively.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these ideas are great, but it seems like they add a burden, an enforcement burden. And so I'm just hoping there'll be time down the line to discuss how we hope to fill that enforcement gap. For example, with facilities like they built for Western, I believe that, I don't know if they're on a highway commercial lot in the county for the river guides, but in some ways I feel like that's much more fitting on a commercial lot because it is a seasonal thing where you expect just some housing when you're in and out of trips, and all you need is communal space. And it's kind of a different thing. If we're going to discuss that in residential neighborhoods, I think we need to have a discussion about having someone on site so that you aren't, if there are, just management issues, just like in the C1 when we used to allow bed and breakfast, we said there had to be a manager on site. And I do feel like in certain situations so that you don't have that burden shift to law enforcement if there are issues, then your commitment to the community has to be to have someone on site as some kind of manager or contact person for the neighbors. I guess other things I just marked were, sorry, I'm just scrolling down.
Well, those are good toppers. Do you have a bottom that you'd want to share? And also, can we add what Ronnie said regarding the RETA to our to the matrix?
It's been tried before, but unsuccessfully, but that doesn't mean we can't try again.
Did we used to have it? Because when you look at Lions Back, originally in the original documents.
Sorry.
Oh, really?
I thought they
voluntary.
tried, and changed it in the final document because.
And sorry, I'd heard you guys use the acronym, but I didn't realize that's what RETA meant, so.
Yeah,
I'm really-
RETA is, and it was voluntary, and it is something that we could, but it's a complicated state thing, but it's still worth
We have
it
to
not to
change the
put in the
state
matrix.
constitution in order to.
And I do think there's an advantage to some of this
But
ADU
people are
stuff, but
talking about
again, the thing that makes me nervous about that, or I feel like we have to add is, it doesn't really do any of us any good unless there's, there are tools in place to make sure those are rented locally as opposed to, become other illegal overnight rentals. So same thing with the tiny homes or even the camping. It does seem like, you could come to town, get a job, file your paperwork that you've got your RV, and then you could quit. I mean, I don't know who's going to enforce that, frankly. So anyway, just again, I think the enforcement piece is huge, but not insurpassable. But same with tiny homes. I had some friends who got really into watching the tiny home shows, and we all know tiny homes can be more expensive than a conventional home that's 4 times the size because of smaller appliances and So that was just the note I had on that. Not opposed to looking at it or piloting it at all, but just if people don't know that about tiny homes, just to be aware. And let's see, that might be,
That's a pretty good list. I'd say that's good.
Are there any,
probably I'll send Nora if I have anything else I come across.
okay, do you
Okay.
have any that you don't want to spend time and energy on?
Well, I mean, like I said,
I think that's,
I don't feel like I can spend time on any of it unless the enforcement piece is addressed. And we all know we have money and staff shortages, so I feel like that's part of the cost of a lot of these. But then
I think that,
also,
yeah.
yeah, there's certain ones I'm opposed to if they're not in a commercial zone or they don't come with some other protections or they're not a pilot. Like I said, I don't know if I'm ready to change everything to require less parking, but I'm willing to pilot it.
okay. Karen, Mike?
Okay, so ADUs, obviously I'm very excited about trying to reduce setbacks and to make it easier for homeowners to allow housing for local workforce. So as well as Ronnie, I think it has to be, it's for local residents. It's not for overnight accommodations. And then tiny homes, the one concern, I love the idea of opening that up and making sure that we make that an easy option for developers. I don't know that having it as RV tiny homes, because I can't really see in R3 allowing an RV park / tiny home. So, I mean, I feel like they're almost two separate things, even though they're not on foundations, but they seem like they're two different building
One
standards.
has wheels and one doesn't, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't know that I would want those combined. Let's see, the amending parking requirements, I'm super, super excited about that because parking is outrageously expensive for developers. And again, I would really like to see where we aren't so reliant on vehicles and, this 5 years of our shuttle pilot program, hopefully some really good usage and data comes out from that. I don't think it's, I live right next to the self-help homes across from Powerhouse. There's a lot of vehicles though. So, I mean, I'm trying to be aware that there's a lot of people who don't want vehicles. There's a lot of people in our community who cannot afford vehicles, but there's also a lot of people who have vehicles and have a lot of stuff. So, I would like to look at reducing parking requirements, especially in the downtown area where it is easier to get to and fro from work and it's more walkable. Let's see, I think we are in a emergency situation where I would like to look at allowing camping. Yeah, you have to have a water hookup, you have to have electricity hookup. It's limited to one RV per house site. I mean, I think those are really reasonable. Again, like everyone else, I don't think we should allow that permanently. Vale and Deed project, I'm not super excited about because it's crazy expensive, and we don't have the funds for that. And then, like Ronnie mentioned, I love the idea of looking at the possibility of us creating deed restrictions in all our zones for permanent residents. We are about to take on 83 units on Mill Creek Drive with Abbey subdivision, and there's nothing to say that those aren't second homes. So, yeah, I mean, those are.
Well, imagine if the Cane Creek condos had a primary residence restriction. They wouldn't have sold in 2 weeks.
They'd have to lower the price.
No, they would have, I think they still would have sold. I think I think locals need longer time. I mean, you can't get a loan approval, a mortgage loan approval. If you're going for the first time, there's an education process for a first-time homeowner. 2 weeks is like that. If you're actually, so if you're a first-time homeowner, like there's putting a purchase contract, it's getting a realtor. You're looking for a realtor, then the realtor puts a purchase contract. Then you've got 30 days to secure your financing. I mean, it takes a little more time. So and so, that parcel down the street that we were looking at the rezone, we do have the lever of asking for primary residence as a rezone contingency, and that would change the scope than what we saw with the Cane Creek condos. So be similar typology, but it would be restricted to locals and probably the same price if they were to agree to that for the rezone,
And it doesn't necessarily need to be one way or the other. The development might have a certain group of unrestricted market rate, but then we would require that part of them be primary residency deed restricted.
Yeah. Okay, are you done?
I think so.
Okay, Mike?
I like Emily's idea of the RV camp park. Although I must say, it kind of reminds me of how Walnut Lane might have got its start in the beginning. I mean, it kind of looked like an RV cart too. So that's, by the way, Caitlin, is while we're considering what to do with phase 1 on Walnut Lane, we considered nice new trailers for a while and decided to go upscale, if you will. And in my mind, if money and time is still enough of an issue, we still might consider nice new trailers for that phase anyway, but that's another subject. I like the idea actually of, how with PAD, a certain fraction of it had to be market rate housing, and that was supposed to subsidize the other dwellings. I kind of like the idea now of not so much as focusing on that, but make that market rate unit be overnight accommodations, okay? As long as the income from that unit would be used to subsidize rents or ownership in some fashion for the rest of the residents in that subdivision. It's another way of underwriting the cost of affordable housing, I guess. So that's kind of an interesting idea, I thought. How has bunk houses worked out? It was a big subject, neighbors are scared to death of it and so forth, but has it, well?
The ones we've had, I've heard some negative term, just saying, oh yeah, we don't want people living like that. But it's better than nothing. And in some cases, it really makes a lot of sense, so.
Yeah, okay. Well, we haven't gotten any nasty letters, so it must not be as bad as people thought, okay? Triplex, can you do triplexes in R2 now?
No.
Well, that might be an evolutionary step to increase the density in R2 without having to resort to PAD. We could consider PAD in R2, but it would take some
Not a
pretty
bad idea.
significant changes, all right, to make that
Great
acceptable.
idea. Would you go fourplex?
Flippa?
No. Would you go for four? Would you go as high as fourplex in R2?
Oh, fuck. I'd have to think about that, okay. But the point is, I'm after incremental density improvements here, as opposed to something really dramatic that set a lot of people off. What, you're gonna put 46 apartments in my backyard? No way. I mean, that's the kind of reaction we ran into. So the incremental thing is something I think would be more saleable and still preserves the character of R2 to a large extent. Take a look at the county's HDHO. I know it's been successful. And you might want to consider not putting in an income requirement, just a residence requirement. It might be easier to track. I don't know. And it touches on another thing I talked about earlier. Is it possible under any circumstances to build market rate housing without any other considerations that's affordable, under the present economic circumstances? I'd like to know, because if the only way we're going to make something happen is by diddling in the market with deed restrictions, then that's something that'll set us down that path. If it's possible to do some kind of market rate development and actually make it affordable, then that would sure simplify life, if we can swing it, but it's not clear that
But
we
Mike,
can.
would you have that open to anyone? I mean, how am I trying to say that? So if we had a market rate development, you're okay with selling those market rate development to,
If they can, if employees, the subject that we're trying to provide housing here for can afford those units.
so
what I'm trying-
would you be okay with market rate if they were sold to people outside of the
No.
community? Okay.
No, it's strictly
Okay,
for
so
employees.
just
and
another
residents.
deed restriction on,
Oh, yeah,
re-
well, it would be, yeah, I see your point, yeah. So it would require deed restrictions.
for
on-
residency?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, and a simple way to say that is any up zone would have a primary residence deed restriction, which is similar to the county's HDHO.
And is that legal? I mean, are we,
Yeah, probably, yeah. I don't know that anything says it's
Lori?
not legal, but,
Little research project for you.
well, and we'll go way more into this once this is the first conversation of many, many, many,
Well,
so.
because then the developers of the R3 again would have come to us with a rezone and we would have said, well, it's contingent on you being primary residency deed restriction. And so
Yeah.
they would have known up front going into their rezone application as opposed to
I am
a
not
reflection.
sure.
You know what I mean?
We can require that as part of a zone change, because zone changes are really regulated by state law pretty heavily. And I don't know if that would be considered a conditional zone change or not. That's something that we have to look into. But I
Well,
think
it would
this
just,
is
it would
great.
be a condition that would be favorable as opposed to a requirement. It would just be so we should structure that.
Okay.
We should figure out how to structure that.
But if it's just a requirement of the zone, then they know, and it's not
Yeah.
contract zoning, it's just the nature of the zone that they're applying for.
Yeah,
So would we have like a primary residence zone overlay?
no, but maybe in the R3 you say, if you're doing more than however many units per acre, the units have to be employee units or local.
Primary
residents.
residence.
Yeah,
Is that what we would do? Well, I guess that's what we're asking for. That's what this council's pumped on is
yeah,
primary.
we'll see different mechanisms and see if
Yep,
we can figure that out.
I think we
I
can.
guess that was about it. That's the only other thing. I still like the idea of PUDs. You guys, somebody told me that PUDs got a bad rap out in your neck of the woods, Tony.
Yeah, but that
Somehow.
was,
So if
that was it was the developer, not the PUD.
Okay, yeah, well, fine. But I still like the idea of PUD. I mean, in my 12 years doing this kind of thing, forever and ever, we're always getting rezoned, and developers make promises, and you never know what they're going to do. PUDs at least give you an idea. You know what you're going to get before it's built, so if we could fix that, that would be great. And I think that's all for me. Thank you. Thank you
Any
guys for putting this
stinkers?
together, by the way.
Mike, did you have any stinkers, things you didn't like on the list?
Stinkers, I don't like I'm with Emily, I don't like the four stories thing. Yeah. I watched Boulder, Colorado do that where I came from, and it just changed it entirely from a,
Yeah, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that if you'll give me a couple minutes, Mayor. So when I moved here, after a few months, we started getting a lot of inquiries about tearing down existing homes and putting in townhomes. And my experience in Park City and Summit County, change is inevitable, and I totally get that. And Moab may turn into more of a second home kind of place than it is today. But I certainly don't want to do anything to hasten that, because that really changes the community character, totally. And once you reach sort of the threshold, it sort of feels like it fails to remain the residents' town. And it's really run by second homeowners, and they have interests,
And it's a whole steel and concrete game, too.
Sorry?
3 stories is the steel and concrete game. It's just different.
Yeah, but, and I thought, we need to do something in our R3 zone in particular, so that we don't just keep getting this over and over and over again, and we fundamentally change the downtown core area and the character of it. And a lot of these houses are owned by older folks too, the houses that have been here forever that are on underused properties. And when their kids end up with them, they want to do something with it more often than not. And so they're going to look at whatever gets them the most money that they can split amongst the siblings, and that would be second home townhomes. And, you know, we want to, I think, do as much as we can to allow that, but also to make sure that we have employee housing as well, hopefully in equal measures. Because it, you know, Moab could change dramatically in the next 10 years, will anyway, but even more dramatically if we don't take some positive action.
So let's talk, because we're at 5:46.
Ronnie has her hand up.
Oh, sorry, Ronnie, go ahead, and then I want to talk sort of next steps.
Just one really quick thing for the next steps conversation. At what point does the continued construction of second homes have the same impact that the continued construction of short-term rentals would have? And I'm just wondering if in the future we can see maybe some information on if other communities in Utah or the Intermountain West are looking at that. That was just the question.
That's a good point. Well, so I more meant like next steps in terms of continuing this conversation. So first things first, it would be helpful if we had this is what we heard from the two of you, sort of a reflection and maybe initial action items for this housing affordability work plan, that then the council could say, yep, this is what we'd like to see, this is where we want to put the resources, and let's have really specific goals and objectives. Because, for example, like Mike's request of, let's look at the R2 allowing up to 3 units. And then I said, how about 4? And so maybe the 4th would be an ADU, you know, a triplex and then an ADU, or, you know, an apartment over a garage or whatever. So that would be something that, if it's on the work plan, that could go right away to Planning Commission, get workshopped, public hearing, and to this council. And so, and I know that it's like, you know, things take time, but we're in July to August, I mean, that could be fruit that we see in September, because we know that process. Like that is a text amendment, much easier so than some of the other, like creating a zone around RVs or tiny homes or something like that. So there is the, you know, the lower of the hanging fruit that could be teased out. So maybe, you know, kind of this is what we heard, and a timeline requirement for each of those items might be really helpful. And then we can have another workshop where you come back with that document and we kind of come to a consensus about it, so that we can see action and we can honestly activate the planning department or the planning commission to take those steps.
That's great, and thank you for all the feedback. I really appreciate it. It was good. And I learned there's some new things, such as where I was considering, and then 4 stories is not real popular. Which
Nora,
I
I'm
agree with.
curious, is there any impediments for developers to build apartments? Because that's sort of, I mean, and I'm just wondering, is there something at the planning department that you need from us to make that easier for developers to make that typology of housing happen?
I think the best thing we can do is lower expectations of what a property can yield, so that so the highest and best use may not be by right 21 units per acre. By right, it's something less than that, and to get higher, you have to do employee housing. That's, I think, the single most significant.
To answer the apartments, it's parking, flat out.
And building height.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
building
parking and
height.
building height.
But even parking, so if you look at the Purple Sage, and it's an overnight accommodation, but it originally was an apartment complex, and it's, is it 6 or 8 units?
I don't know.
Purple Sage. With the sprockets painted on the,
8.
is it 8? So 8 units, there is, you know, there's, if somebody wanted to build that 8 unit in R3, they wouldn't be able to build it on that lot because of the parking requirements. So they are grandfathered to have on-street parking for the people that are staying there. That is the crux of apartments, is parking.
Okay, and well, if there is a height issue as well, and if there's certain places that height would be more acceptable to go higher, I would be very open to looking at that. Because, I mean, we need the housing. I mean, we need to get really clear as to, I mean, it's,
So like height was a real stickler when we were looking at the apartments on Mill Creek heading up to USU because of the looming on the adjoining neighbor. Do you remember?
That was before our time.
Before our time.
Ronnie had her hand up again, too.
Oh, yep, Ronnie?
Oh, I'm happy to fill someone in on that because that was during my time. But just also the point that, I mean, so long as we're in, you know, a capitalist system, the main reason you aren't seeing apartments is because you can make more money building something else.
Right,
And that's
exactly.
the
It's a
part
market factor.
that you don't get away with. I mean, we were promised apartments, years ago with that project. And have we seen them yet? No. So just saying.
And it's probably worth it to mention too, that while we want to hang the employee shortage on housing, it is worth it also to recognize that right now, the J1 visas are not being issued. So we have an employee shortage because certain business owners that have built their business model around bringing in outside labor force because of coronavirus haven't been able to do so. And so that's a big part of the service industry. You know, I think we're just hanging a lot on housing, but there is that factor as well as why we're not able to get more employees in Moab for the service workers positions. Okay, it's 6:53, so unless anyone has any burning comments before we take a quick recess, and we'll rejoin at 7 for a regular meeting.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Nora. Thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you, guys.